The ballroom of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel buzzed with the refined chatter of America's most prestigious medical professionals. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables adorned with crisp white linens, where doctors, researchers, and medical journalists had gathered for the annual Medical Excellence Award ceremony. At the head table, Dr. Marcus Whitfield adjusted his perfectly knotted silk tie and surveyed the room with the satisfaction of a man who knew he was about to be celebrated. Before we dive deeper into this story of hidden truths and shattered assumptions, I'm curious about where you're watching from tonight. Whether you're in a bustling city hospital break room or a quiet suburban living room, this tale of intellectual deception might hit closer to home than you think. Drop a comment and let me know what state or country you're tuning in from. Marcus had spent the better part of 2 decades building his reputation as one of the most insightful medical columnists in the country. His weekly pieces in the prestigious Journal of American Medicine were devoured by physicians nationwide, each article a masterclass in translating complex medical concepts into accessible, compelling prose. Tonight, he would receive the coveted Hippocrates Award for Medical Communication, the highest honor in medical journalism. Beside him sat Elena Whitfield, his wife of 15 years. Where Marcus commanded attention with his imposing 6-foot frame and silver-touched temples, Elena seemed to fade into the background. Her modest navy dress was elegant but understated, her dark hair pulled back in a simple chignon. She had learned long ago that at these events, her role was to smile graciously, nod at appropriate moments, and remain beautifully invisible. As the evening progressed through courses of herb-crusted salmon and conversations about breakthrough treatments, Elena found herself listening to Dr. Patricia Chun, a renowned cardiologist from Stanford, discuss the latest developments in gene therapy. Elena's eyes lit up with genuine interest as Dr. Chun described the challenges of targeting specific cellular pathways. Marcus noticed Elena's engagement and felt that familiar flutter of embarrassment. He placed a firm hand on her shoulder and leaned in close. "You'll have to forgive my wife," he said to Dr. Chun with a practiced chuckle. Elena tries her best to follow along, but this level of medical discussion is a bit beyond her comprehension. She's much better suited to planning dinner parties than dissecting research methodologies. Dr. Chun looked momentarily puzzled. "I was actually impressed by her questions about the ethical implications of gene editing," she replied diplomatically. Marcus's laugh grew louder, drawing attention from neighboring tables. "Oh, Elena probably picked that up from some documentary she watched. She has a talent for repeating things that sound intelligent without truly understanding the underlying science. It's quite charming, really, but hardly the same as genuine intellectual discourse." Elena's cheeks flushed pink, but she remained silent, her fingers tightening almost imperceptibly around her water glass. This was not the first time Marcus had dismissed her contributions in public, and she suspected it wouldn't be the last. Over the years, she had grown accustomed to being characterized as the beautiful but intellectually limited wife who was fortunate enough to bask in her husband's brilliance. When the awards portion of the evening began, Marcus straightened in his chair with obvious anticipation. The presenter, Dr. Robert Hendricks from Johns Hopkins, took the stage and began reading from the teleprompter. "Tonight, we honor a physician whose exceptional ability to communicate complex medical concepts has educated and inspired thousands of healthcare professionals. Dr. Marcus Whitfield's column has become required reading in medical schools across the nation, bridging the gap between cutting-edge research and practical application." The audience erupted in applause as Marcus rose from his seat, buttoning his tuxedo jacket with theatrical precision. He strode to the podium with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his own intellectual superiority. Elena watched from her seat, clapping politely as cameras flashed and colleagues offered congratulatory nods. Marcus began his acceptance speech with characteristic eloquence. "When I first began writing my column," he declared, his voice carrying easily through the sound system, "I knew that medical communication required a unique blend of scientific rigor and literary skill. The ability to synthesize complex research, identify emerging trends, and present them in a compelling narrative is not a common talent. It requires years of training, extensive clinical experience, and what I can only describe as an innate intellectual curiosity that drives one to constantly seek deeper understanding." He paused for effect, allowing the audience to absorb his words. Many people believe that good medical writing is simply a matter of dumbing down complex concepts. But true excellence in this field demands the opposite approach. It requires elevating the discourse, challenging readers to think more critically, and presenting information in ways that expand rather than limit intellectual engagement. Elena found herself studying her husband's face as he spoke. There was something almost hypnotic about his delivery, the way he commanded the room with such apparent authority. Yet as she listened to him describe the intellectual demands of medical writing, she felt an odd disconnect, as if she were hearing someone describe a talent they had observed rather than one they possessed. The speech continued for nearly 10 minutes, with Marcus elaborating on his writing philosophy, his research methods, and his commitment to advancing medical education through clear communication. He spoke about late nights spent reviewing research papers, the challenge of staying current with rapidly evolving medical knowledge, and the responsibility he felt toward his readers. Throughout the entire speech, he never once acknowledged Elena's presence. Not a glance, not a mention of spousal support, not even the customary thank you to family members that was standard in such acceptance speeches. Elena sat perfectly still, maintaining her gracious smile while feeling increasingly invisible. As Marcus concluded with a flourish about the future of medical communication, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Colleagues rushed to congratulate him as he returned to his seat, their praise flowing freely. Dr. Whitfield, your insights into autoimmune disorders last month were absolutely brilliant. Marcus, that piece on surgical innovations changed how I approach patient consultations. The accolades continued as Marcus basked in the recognition, his chest swelling with obvious pride. Elena watched the interactions with a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite identify. There was pride, certainly, in her husband's professional success. But there was something else, something that had been growing stronger with each passing year of their marriage. A sense of displacement, as if she were watching someone else receive credit for work that felt strangely familiar. When Dr. Chen approached their table during the dessert course, she made a point of addressing Elena directly. I wanted to continue our earlier conversation about gene therapy ethics, she said warmly. Your perspective on informed consent protocols was particularly thoughtful. Before Elena could respond, Marcus intervened with practiced smoothness. I'm afraid Elena might have given you the wrong impression earlier, he said, his tone remaining pleasant but firm. She has a wonderful heart and genuinely cares about medical ethics, but her understanding is more emotional than analytical. She lacks the technical background to engage in truly substantive discussions about research protocols or treatment methodologies. Dr. Chen's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. I see, she replied carefully. I suppose I misunderstood. Not at all, Marcus continued, clearly enjoying the opportunity to elaborate. Elena is incredibly supportive of my work, and she's developed a remarkable ability to absorb medical terminology from our dinner conversations. But there's a significant difference between repeating information and truly comprehending its implications. The kind of critical thinking required for medical research and communication develops only through years of rigorous academic training and clinical experience. As the evening wound down and colleagues began to depart, Elena found herself alone at the table while Marcus continued to network across the room. She watched him gesture animatedly as he discussed his latest column ideas with a group of department heads, his voice carrying with that familiar authority that seemed to make everyone lean in closer. The weight of the evening's dismissals settled over Elena like a familiar blanket she had worn too many times before. Tomorrow, Marcus would return to his study to work on his next column, and she would resume her role as the supportive wife whose primary contribution was ensuring his coffee stayed warm and his writing environment remained undisturbed. But as Elena sat in the gradually emptying ballroom, surrounded by the remnants of an evening celebrating intellectual achievement, something shifted in her expression. Her posture straightened slightly, and for just a moment, the careful mask of gracious submission slipped to reveal something sharper underneath. Something that suggested that perhaps Dr. Marcus Whitfield's greatest intellectual achievement might not have been entirely his own. The morning after the awards ceremony found Marcus in his mahogany-paneled home office, surrounded by the trappings of his intellectual success. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves displayed medical textbooks, research journals, and copies of his published articles in ornate frames. His massive oak desk dominated the room, its surface meticulously organized with neat stacks of research papers, his laptop positioned at the perfect angle, and his coveted Hippocrates Award now prominently displayed beside his medical degree. Elena entered quietly, carrying a steaming cup of coffee prepared exactly as Marcus preferred it. Colombian blend, 2 sugars, a splash of cream, served in his favorite porcelain mug with the Johns Hopkins logo. She set it down carefully on the leather coaster beside his keyboard, moving with the practiced silence of someone who had learned not to disturb a great mind at work. Marcus barely glanced up from his screen, where he was reviewing reader responses to his latest column on infectious disease protocols. The comments were uniformly glowing. "Brilliant analysis as always, Dr. Whitfield. Your insights changed how our entire department approaches patient care." Reading from one of the top-rated responses, he smiled with satisfaction. Elena lingered for a moment, studying the research papers scattered across his desk. She noticed several studies on antibiotic resistance that caught her attention, particularly one from the European Journal of Clinical Microbiology that discussed novel treatment approaches. The methodology looked fascinating, and she found herself wondering about the statistical significance of their control groups. Marcus noticed her gaze and immediately swept the papers into a protective pile. "Elena, please," he said with barely concealed irritation. "These are complex research documents that require extensive medical knowledge to interpret properly. I can't have you accidentally disturbing my organization system or misplacing something important." She stepped back apologetically. "I was just curious about the antibiotic resistance study." The approach seemed innovative compared to traditional treatment protocols. Marcus's expression shifted to that familiar mixture of condescension and amusement. "Darling, these papers contain statistical analyses and clinical trial data that take years of medical training to understand. You might recognize some of the terminology from our dinner conversations, but comprehending the actual research methodology and clinical implications is entirely different. It's like the difference between recognizing that a painting is beautiful and understanding the artistic techniques that created it." Elena nodded and turned to leave, but Marcus wasn't finished. "In fact," he continued, his voice taking on a lecturing tone, "this particular study involves complex biostatistical modeling and pharmacokinetic analysis that most physicians find challenging. The mathematical components alone require advanced understanding of statistical variance and confidence intervals. It's not something that can be grasped through casual reading or surface-level curiosity." That afternoon, Marcus hosted a dinner party for several colleagues, including Dr. Patricia Chun from the previous evening and Dr. James Morrison, the chief of infectious diseases at Metropolitan General Hospital. Elena had spent hours preparing Marcus's favorite meal, herb-crusted rack of lamb with roasted vegetables, knowing that he enjoyed impressing guests with what he called Elena's domestic talents. As the conversation turned to recent developments in medical research, Dr. Morrison mentioned the same European study that Elena had noticed earlier. The statistical model they used was particularly elegant, he noted. Their approach to controlling for patient variables while maintaining statistical power was impressive. Elena found herself leaning forward slightly, genuinely interested in the technical discussion. She had read about similar methodological challenges in several recent papers and was curious about the practical applications. Marcus noticed her attention and felt that familiar embarrassment creeping up his neck. He quickly interjected with a knowing chuckle. "Elena is always fascinated when we discuss our work," he announced to the table. "She tries so hard to follow along with our medical conversations, but I'm afraid the technical aspects are quite beyond her comprehension. It's sweet, really, how she pretends to understand complex research methodology." Dr. Chen looked uncomfortable. "She seemed quite knowledgeable yesterday evening," she observed carefully. Marcus waved his hand dismissively. "Elena has developed an impressive vocabulary of medical terms from listening to my phone calls and reading over my shoulder," he explained. "She can repeat phrases like biostatistical modeling and pharmacokinetic analysis, but she has no real understanding of what those concepts actually mean. It's rather like a parrot that can recite Shakespeare without comprehending the poetry." The comparison hung in the air uncomfortably, and Elena felt heat rising in her cheeks. She excused herself to check on dessert, needing a moment away from the table to compose herself. In the kitchen, She gripped the marble countertop and took several deep breaths, the familiar sting of public humiliation washing over her. When she returned with the chocolate souffle, the conversation had moved to Marcus's upcoming book deal. His publisher wanted to expand his most popular columns into a comprehensive guide for medical professionals, and Marcus was clearly excited about the project. "You know," Dr. Morrison was saying, "your writing has a unique clarity that makes complex topics accessible without sacrificing intellectual rigor. That's a rare gift in medical communication." Marcus practically glowed with the praise. "I've always believed that true expertise manifests in the ability to explain complicated concepts simply," he replied. "It requires deep understanding of the subject matter combined with sophisticated communication skills. Many physicians can treat patients effectively, but few can translate their clinical knowledge into compelling written form." Elena served the dessert silently, listening as Marcus elaborated on his writing process, his research methods, and his philosophy about medical education. He spoke with such authority, such confidence in his own abilities, that even she found herself momentarily convinced by his self-portrayal as a brilliant medical communicator. But as the evening progressed, Elena noticed something odd. When Dr. Chin mentioned specific details from Marcus's recent column on autoimmune disorders, Marcus's responses seemed oddly general, lacking the precision she would have expected from someone who had spent weeks researching the topic. He spoke eloquently about the importance of patient-centered care and the challenges of differential diagnosis, but when pressed for specifics about particular treatment protocols, his answers remained frustratingly vague. After the guests departed, Elena found herself alone in the living room while Marcus retreated to his office to respond to emails praising his latest work. She settled into her reading chair with a cup of tea and opened the current issue of the New England Journal of Medicine, a subscription that had somehow found its way to their home despite Marcus's assertions that such publications were beyond her intellectual reach. The lead article discussed breakthrough treatments for neurological disorders, and Elena found herself completely absorbed in the research methodology and clinical implications. The authors had identified novel biomarkers that could predict treatment response with remarkable accuracy, potentially revolutionizing how physicians approached patient care. She made mental notes about the statistical significance of their findings and the elegance of their experimental design. As she read, Elena's mind began connecting the research to other studies she had encountered, seeing patterns and possibilities that excited her in ways she couldn't fully explain. There was something deeply satisfying about understanding the complex interplay between theoretical research and practical application, about grasping the sophisticated reasoning that drove medical advancement. She was so engrossed in the journal that she didn't notice Marcus entering the room until he spoke. "Elena, what exactly are you doing?" he asked, his tone sharp with disapproval. She looked up, startled. "Just reading," she replied simply. Marcus approached and saw the journal in her hands, his expression darkening. "Elena, this is exactly what I was talking about earlier. These publications are written for medical professionals with advanced degrees and years of clinical experience. The content is highly technical and assumes extensive background knowledge that you simply don't possess." He took the journal from her hands, flipping through the pages with obvious frustration. "This article you're pretending to read involves complex neurological research, statistical analysis, and clinical trial methodology. The authors assume readers understand concepts like multivariate regression analysis, biomarker validation, and therapeutic index calculations. You can't possibly comprehend material of this sophistication." Elena felt something shift inside her as she watched Marcus lecture her about intellectual limitations she supposedly possessed. The certainty in his voice, the absolute conviction that she was incapable of understanding what she had just been reading with perfect clarity, struck her as profoundly absurd. "I found the biomarker research particularly interesting," she said quietly. "The correlation between protein expression levels and treatment outcomes was quite compelling." Marcus stared at her for a moment, then shook his head with exaggerated patience. "Elena, you're simply repeating terminology you've heard without understanding its meaning. Biomarker research involves sophisticated molecular biology and statistical modeling that requires years of specialized training to comprehend. The fact that you can recite the phrases doesn't mean you understand the underlying science." He closed the journal definitively, and placed it on a high shelf, as if removing temptation from a child who had been caught playing with adult belongings. I think it would be better if you focused your reading on topics more suited to your background and interests. Perhaps some fiction or lifestyle magazines that don't require technical expertise to enjoy properly. That night, as Elena lay in bed listening to Marcus's satisfied snoring beside her, she stared at the ceiling and wondered when exactly she had become someone whose intellectual capacity was considered so limited. She remembered a time, years ago, when her thoughts and opinions had seemed to matter, when people had listened to her ideas with respect rather than condescending amusement. But those memories felt distant now, almost like they belonged to someone else entirely. Over the years, Marcus's confident assessments of her limitations had become an accepted truth, repeated so often and with such authority that even she had begun to question her own capabilities. Yet something about tonight felt different. The way she had understood that neurological research, the connections she had made between different studies, the excitement she had felt while reading complex medical analysis, all of it seemed to contradict Marcus's fundamental assumptions about her intellectual capacity. As she drifted towards sleep, Elena found herself wondering what might happen if someone actually tested those assumptions. What if someone discovered that Dr. Marcus Whitfield's greatest certainty about his wife's intellectual limitations was, in fact, his greatest misconception? 3 months after the medical conference, Marcus received news that would cement his reputation as one of America's most influential medical writers. The American Medical Writers Association had selected him for their Lifetime Achievement Award, recognizing his exceptional contribution to medical communication over the past 2 decades. The ceremony would be held at the prestigious Kennedy Center in Washington, with an audience of over 1,000 medical professionals, journalists, and industry leaders. Elena watched Marcus prepare for the event with his usual meticulous attention to detail. He had commissioned a new tuxedo from his tailor on Savile Row, spent hours rehearsing his acceptance speech, and arranged for a professional photographer to capture what he called his crowning moment. The award represented the pinnacle of recognition in medical writing, and Marcus intended to savor every second of his triumph. The evening of the ceremony, Elena sat in the 3rd row of the Kennedy Center's concert hall, wearing an elegant black gown that Marcus had selected to ensure she would photograph while beside him. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation as medical luminaries filled the ornate seats, their conversations creating a sophisticated hum that spoke to the gravity of the occasion. When Marcus's name was announced as the recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award, the audience erupted in sustained applause. He walked to the podium with the bearing of a man who had spent years imagining this exact moment, his silver hair catching the stage lights as he approached the microphone. Elena watched from her seat, noting how naturally he commanded the attention of a room filled with some of the most accomplished professionals in medicine. Marcus began his speech by acknowledging the honor of receiving such recognition from his peers. "Standing before you tonight," he declared, his voice carrying easily through the vast auditorium, "I am humbled to receive this award for contributions to medical writing. But I want to speak honestly about what sets exceptional medical communication apart from merely competent writing." He paused for effect, surveying the audience with the confidence of someone who knew his words carried weight. True excellence in medical writing requires more than just technical knowledge or facility with language. It demands what I can only describe as intellectual courage, the willingness to tackle complex subjects that intimidate lesser minds, the ability to synthesize vast amounts of research into coherent narratives that advance understanding rather than simply regurgitate information. Elena found herself studying Marcus's face as he spoke, noting the absolute conviction in his expression. There was no trace of doubt, no hint of imposter syndrome that might plague someone receiving such recognition. He spoke as if describing abilities he had always possessed with perfect certainty. The speech continued with Marcus elaborating on his writing philosophy and research methods. He described the intellectual demands of translating cutting-edge research into accessible prose, the challenges of staying current with rapidly evolving medical knowledge, and the responsibility he felt toward advancing medical education through clear communication. But then Marcus shifted his tone, and Elena felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. She recognized the expression that crossed his face, the slight smile that always preceded his most cutting observations about intellectual limitations he perceived in others. "Now, I know many of you have wondered about the source of my insights," Marcus continued, his voice taking on a more personal quality. "People often ask whether I have some secret method for generating ideas or maintaining the level of analysis that has characterized my work. The truth is quite simple. Exceptional medical writing flows from exceptional intellectual capacity combined with rigorous training and years of disciplined study." He chuckled softly, and Elena's dread deepened. "I mention this because I believe it's important to acknowledge the intellectual demands of our profession. Not everyone possesses the analytical capabilities required for sophisticated medical communication. Take my wife Elena, for example, who is here with me tonight." Elena felt every eye in the auditorium turn toward her, and heat flooded her cheeks as Marcus gestured in her direction. She managed to maintain her composed expression, but inside, she felt as if the floor were dropping away beneath her feet. "Elena is wonderfully supportive of my work," Marcus continued, completely oblivious to his wife's mortification. "She tries her best to engage with medical topics during our dinner conversations, but she simply lacks the intellectual foundation necessary for genuine comprehension. It's quite endearing, really, watching her attempt to follow discussions about research methodology or clinical analysis. She can repeat the terminology she hears me use, but the underlying concepts remain completely beyond her grasp." The audience shifted uncomfortably, many attendees exchanging glances that suggested they found Marcus's public commentary about his wife's supposed intellectual limitations inappropriate for such an occasion. But Marcus seemed energized by his theme, warming to the subject with obvious relish. "This is why I have such deep appreciation for those of you who share this calling," he declared. "Medical writing is not a field for intellectual dilettantes or casual observers. It requires the kind of rigorous analytical thinking that develops only through years of advanced education and clinical experience. The ability to read complex research papers, understand statistical methodologies, and synthesize findings into coherent arguments is a rare gift that should never be taken for granted." Elena sat frozen in her seat as Marcus concluded his speech with a flourish about the future of medical communication and the responsibility of intellectual leaders to maintain standards of excellence. The applause that followed seemed more polite than enthusiastic, and she noticed several colleagues avoiding eye contact as Marcus returned to his seat beside her. The remainder of the ceremony passed in a blur of congratulations and networking conversations where Elena remained essentially invisible. Colleagues praised Marcus's contributions to medical writing while she stood silently beside him, her mind replaying his words about her supposed intellectual inadequacies. The public humiliation felt more devastating than any private dismissal, witnessed as it was by hundreds of her husband's professional peers. That night, in their hotel suite overlooking the Potomac River, Elena made a decision that had been building for months. While Marcus celebrated in the bathroom, recounting highlights from his speech to anyone who would listen on the phone, she sat at the writing desk and opened her laptop. Her fingers trembled slightly as she typed the name of the law firm she had researched weeks earlier, a prestigious Washington practice that specialized in complex divorce proceedings. The next morning, Elena informed Marcus that she wanted to end their marriage. His initial reaction was one of complete bewilderment, as if the concept that his wife might have independent thoughts about their relationship had never occurred to him. When the reality of her request finally penetrated his consciousness, his bewilderment transformed into something approaching amusement. "Elena, darling, you can't be serious," he said with a patronizing smile. "You're clearly upset about something trivial, probably premenstrual hormones affecting your judgment. Why don't we table this discussion until you're feeling more rational?" But Elena's resolve had crystallized into something unshakable. She contacted the law firm that afternoon and scheduled a consultation for the following week. When she informed Marcus that she had retained legal counsel, his amusement evolved into irritated concern about the potential inconvenience of divorce proceedings. "This is completely unnecessary," he protested. "We can resolve any marital issues through reasonable discussion. There's no need to involve lawyers and complicate what should be a simple conversation between two adults." However, as the legal process began, Marcus's primary concern seemed to focus on protecting his intellectual property and professional assets. He assumed that Elena would receive some portion of their financial holdings, but he was determined to maintain complete control over his writing career, book royalties, and professional reputation. During their first meeting with attorneys, Marcus's lawyer outlined their position with confident precision. Dr. Whitfield's medical writing represents his core professional identity and primary source of income, the attorney explained. These intellectual assets were developed entirely through his expertise, education, and individual efforts over the past 20 years. Mrs. Whitfield made no meaningful contributions to the creation or development of his written work. Elena's attorney, Catherine Morrison, was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who specialized in complex asset division cases. She listened to Marcus's position with professional neutrality, taking careful notes as his lawyer enumerated the various intellectual properties they considered exclusively his domain. When Marcus's attorney finished his presentation, Catherine Morrison looked up from her legal pad with an expression that Elena couldn't quite interpret. "Just to clarify," she said carefully, "you're asserting that Mrs. Whitfield had no involvement whatsoever in Dr. Whitfield's writing career. No research assistance, no editorial input, no collaboration of any kind." Marcus's lawyer nodded emphatically. "That's correct. Dr. Whitfield's medical writing represents purely individual intellectual achievement. His wife lacks the educational background and professional qualifications necessary to contribute meaningfully to medical journalism of this sophistication." Catherine Morrison made another note, her pen moving deliberately across the page. "I see," she replied. "That's a very specific claim about the nature of intellectual collaboration in marriage. I trust you're prepared to document that assertion with appropriate evidence." Something in her tone made Elena look up sharply, and for the first time in months, she felt a flutter of hope that perhaps someone might finally question the assumptions that had defined her marriage for so long. Marcus's attorney appeared confused by Catherine's response. "I'm not sure what kind of documentation would be required," he said. "Dr. Whitfield's qualifications and professional achievements speak for themselves. His wife has no medical training or writing experience that would enable meaningful contribution to his work." Catherine Morrison smiled slightly, and Elena caught a glimpse of something that looked remarkably like anticipation in the attorney's eyes. "Well," she said, closing her legal pad with decisive finality, "I suppose we'll have an opportunity to examine that assumption more thoroughly as we proceed. Sometimes the most confident assertions prove to be the most interesting to investigate." As they left the law office that afternoon, Elena walked beside Marcus in silence while he voiced his irritation about legal complications and unnecessary delays. But for the first time in years, Elena felt something she had almost forgotten was possible. The sense that perhaps the story Marcus had been telling about her limitations might finally be subjected to serious scrutiny. And deep in her heart, she suspected that scrutiny might reveal truths that would shock everyone in that room, most especially her husband. The divorce proceedings commenced 3 weeks later in the imposing chambers of Judge Patricia Hendricks, a woman renowned for her meticulous attention to detail and impatience with frivolous claims. The mahogany-paneled courtroom exuded gravitas, with tall windows filtering morning sunlight across polished surfaces that had witnessed decades of legal battles over assets, custody, and the dissolution of once promising unions. Marcus entered the courtroom with his characteristic confidence intact, dressed in his finest charcoal suit and carrying a leather briefcase filled with documentation of his professional achievements. He had spent hours with his attorney preparing testimony about his intellectual contributions to medical writing, assembling evidence of his awards, publications, and professional recognition. In his mind, the proceedings were merely a formality that would confirm what everyone already knew about his singular talents and Elena's peripheral role in his success. Elena sat beside Catherine Morrison at the opposing counsel table, wearing a navy blue suit that was elegant but understated. Her posture was straight and alert, quite different from the self-effacing demeanor she had maintained throughout their marriage. Marcus noticed the change but attributed it to nervousness about the legal proceedings rather than any fundamental shift in her character or capabilities. Marcus's attorney, Richard Blackwood, called his client to the witness stand with obvious confidence. "Dr. Whitfield," he began, Please tell the court about your professional background and qualifications in medical writing. Marcus straightened in his chair and launched into a well-rehearsed recitation of his credentials. I graduated from Harvard Medical School with highest honors, he declared, his voice carrying the authority that had made him such an effective public speaker. I completed my residency in internal medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital, followed by a fellowship in infectious diseases at Johns Hopkins. For the past 20 years, I have built what many consider the most influential medical writing career in America. He continued with obvious pride, describing his weekly column in the Journal of American Medicine, his numerous awards including the recent Lifetime Achievement Recognition, and his upcoming book deal with a prestigious medical publisher. Throughout his testimony, Marcus painted himself as a solitary genius whose intellectual achievements were entirely self-generated. When Blackwood asked about Elena's role in his career, Marcus's response was swift and dismissive. My wife has been wonderfully supportive in maintaining our household and providing the stable domestic environment that allows me to focus on my writing, he said. However, she lacks the medical education and analytical capabilities necessary to contribute meaningfully to professional medical communication. Her background is entirely unrelated to medicine or academic writing. Marcus elaborated on Elena's supposed limitations with the same confidence he had displayed at the Kennedy Center. She has no medical training, no research experience, and no educational foundation that would enable her to understand the complex scientific concepts that form the basis of my work. While she occasionally expresses interest in medical topics, her comprehension remains at a superficial level that would be inappropriate for serious academic or professional writing. Catherine Morrison listened to Marcus's testimony with the expression of someone taking careful mental notes. When Blackwood finished his questioning, she rose from her seat with measured deliberation and approached the witness stand. Dr. Whitfield, she began, her tone conversational but precise. You've testified that your wife lacks the educational background necessary for meaningful contribution to medical writing. Is that correct? Absolutely, Marcus replied without hesitation. Elena has never demonstrated the kind of analytical thinking or technical knowledge required for sophisticated medical communication. Catherine nodded thoughtfully. So you would be surprised to learn that Mrs. Whitfield holds a doctorate in molecular biology from MIT, where she graduated summa cum laude and received the Departmental Award for Outstanding Research in Cellular Biochemistry. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He stared at Catherine Morrison, then at Elena, his mouth opening and closing without producing sound. The confident expression that had characterized his entire testimony crumbled into bewildered confusion. I'm sorry, what did you say? Marcus finally managed to stammer. Catherine Morrison approached the evidence table and retrieved a manila folder. She withdrew several documents and handed them to the bailiff. Your Honor, I would like to enter into evidence Mrs. Whitfield's academic transcripts from MIT, including her doctoral dissertation on protein synthesis mechanisms in antibiotic-resistant bacteria, which was subsequently published in Nature and has been cited in over 300 peer-reviewed papers. Judge Hendricks examined the documents carefully while Marcus sat in stunned silence. The transcripts clearly showed Elena's exceptional academic performance, her research accomplishments, and the prestigious fellowship she had received for postdoctoral study at the National Institutes of Health. Catherine Morrison continued her systematic demolition of Marcus's assumptions. Perhaps you would also be surprised to learn that Mrs. Whitfield completed additional graduate work in medical communication at Columbia University, where she studied under Dr. Sarah Chun, currently the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Clinical Research. Marcus felt the courtroom beginning to spin around him. Every certainty he had held about his wife's intellectual capabilities was dissolving before his eyes, replaced by revelations that seemed impossible to reconcile with the woman he thought he had known for 15 years. Dr. Whitfield, Catherine Morrison continued relentlessly, you testified that your wife has no research experience. Are you aware that she published 17 peer-reviewed papers during her graduate and postdoctoral work, including 3 first-author publications in top-tier journals? No, Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. That's not possible. Elena never mentioned any of this. She never told me about graduate school or research publications. Catherine Morrison's expression remained professionally neutral, but Elena caught a glimpse of something that might have been satisfaction in her attorney's eyes. Perhaps Mrs. Whitfield felt that her educational achievements weren't valued in your household, she suggested. Sometimes people stop mentioning accomplishments when they're consistently dismissed or ignored. Elena watched her husband's face as the weight of these revelations settled over him. The supreme confidence that had defined Marcus throughout their marriage was evaporating, replaced by confusion and the dawning realization that his fundamental assumptions about their relationship might be completely wrong. But Catherine Morrison wasn't finished. She called Dr. Sarah Chun to the witness stand, and Elena felt her heart rate accelerate as her former mentor was sworn in. Dr. Chun had aged gracefully since Elena had known her at Columbia, her silver hair now cut in an elegant bob that framed her intelligent features. Dr. Chun, Catherine Morrison began. Do you know the defendant in this case, Elena Whitfield? Yes, Dr. Chun replied, her voice clear and professional. I had the privilege of working with Elena during her graduate studies in medical communication at Columbia University. She was one of the most gifted students I encountered during my 25 years of teaching. Catherine Morrison nodded approvingly. Can you describe the nature of her work in your program? Dr. Chun turned slightly toward the judge. Elena specialized in translating complex medical research into accessible formats for both professional and public audiences. Her master's thesis examined effective communication strategies for conveying statistical uncertainty in clinical trial results. It was groundbreaking work that influenced how we think about medical journalism ethics. Marcus felt as if he were drowning in revelations that contradicted everything he thought he knew about his wife. The woman he had repeatedly dismissed as intellectually limited had apparently earned advanced degrees from two of the most prestigious institutions in the country. Dr. Chun, Catherine Morrison continued, are you familiar with Mrs. Whitfield's current work? Dr. Chun smiled slightly. Elena has been contributing to our journal for several years under a pen name. Her articles on antibiotic resistance and infectious disease protocols have been among our most popular and widely cited pieces. She has a remarkable gift for making complex research accessible without sacrificing scientific rigor. The courtroom fell silent as the implications of Dr. Chin's testimony sank in. Marcus stared at Elena with an expression of complete bewilderment, as if seeing her clearly for the first time in their 15-year marriage. Catherine Morrison approached the evidence table again and withdrew another folder. Your Honor, I would like to enter correspondence between Mrs. Whitfield and several major medical journals, documenting her ongoing contributions to medical literature under the pen name E.M. Richardson. Judge Hendricks examined the letters carefully. The correspondence revealed Elena's extensive collaboration with editors at prestigious medical publications, her role in reviewing and improving submitted articles, and the high regard in which her work was held by leading figures in medical journalism. Dr. Whitfield, Catherine Morrison said, turning back toward Marcus, are you familiar with the work of E.M. Richardson? Marcus nodded slowly, his face pale. E.M. Richardson's articles on infectious disease treatment have influenced my own thinking about antibiotic protocols, he admitted reluctantly. Catherine Morrison smiled. So you've been influenced by your wife's medical writing without realizing it. How interesting that someone you consider intellectually incapable of contributing to medical communication has actually been shaping your professional opinions. The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Marcus realized that he had spent years unknowingly learning from the very woman he had consistently dismissed as too limited to understand medical research. The irony was so profound that he felt physically ill. Elena watched her husband's transformation with a mixture of emotions she couldn't fully identify. There was satisfaction in seeing his arrogance finally challenged, but also something approaching sadness at witnessing the collapse of illusions that had sustained him for so long. Catherine Morrison returned to her seat, clearly satisfied with the impact of her revelations. But Elena knew this was only the beginning. The most devastating truth was still waiting to be unveiled, a secret so shocking that it would completely rewrite the story of Marcus's celebrated career. As Judge Hendricks called for a brief recess, Marcus sat frozen in the witness chair, staring at Elena as if she had transformed into someone entirely different. In many ways, she had. The quiet, supposedly limited woman he had married was revealing herself to be an accomplished scientist and medical writer whose intellectual achievements rivaled or exceeded his own. But even Marcus couldn't imagine how much more devastating the revelations were about to become. When court resumed after the recess, Catherine Morrison called her next witness with the precision of a surgeon making the most critical incision of an operation. Dr. Michael Harrison, she announced, editor-in-chief of the Journal of American Medicine. A distinguished man in his 60s approached the witness stand, his silver beard neatly trimmed and his expression carrying the gravity appropriate to someone who had overseen medical publishing for over 2 decades. Marcus recognized Dr. Harrison immediately, having worked with him for years on his weekly column. The sight of his longtime editor in Elena's corner filled Marcus with fresh dread about what revelations might be coming. Dr. Harrison, Catherine Morrison began after he was sworn in, "Are you familiar with Dr. Marcus Whitfield's column in your publication?" "Of course," Dr. Harrison replied, his voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to speaking at medical conferences. "Dr. Whitfield's column has been a cornerstone of our journal for nearly 20 years. It's one of our most popular features among medical professionals." Marcus felt a momentary flutter of relief. Perhaps Dr. Harrison would testify to his exceptional writing abilities and help restore some credibility to his claims about intellectual superiority. But Catherine Morrison's next question shattered any hope of vindication. "Dr. Harrison, can you tell the court about your direct editorial relationship with Dr. Whitfield during the creation of his columns?" Dr. Harrison shifted slightly in his chair, and Marcus detected something in his expression that made his stomach clench with apprehension. "Actually," he said carefully, "my primary editorial correspondence regarding the Whitfield column has been with Mrs. Elena Whitfield, not her husband." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs that Judge Hendricks quickly silenced with her gavel. Marcus felt as if someone had struck him in the chest with a sledgehammer. The words made no sense, contradicting everything he understood about his own professional relationships and creative process. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" Marcus's attorney stammered, clearly as bewildered as his client. Dr. Harrison looked directly at Elena before continuing. "For the past 18 years, Mrs. Elena Whitfield has been the primary author and researcher behind what we publish as Dr. Marcus Whitfield's column. She submits the original drafts, conducts the research, and handles all editorial correspondence regarding content and revisions." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Marcus stared at Dr. Harrison with an expression of complete incomprehension, as if the editor were speaking in a foreign language. The revelation was so fundamentally at odds with Marcus's understanding of reality that his mind struggled to process the information. Catherine Morrison approached the evidence table and retrieved a thick folder. "Your Honor, I would like to enter into evidence 18 years of email correspondence between Mrs. Whitfield and the Journal of American Medicine, documenting her role as the primary author of what has been published under her husband's name." Judge Hendricks accepted the folder and began examining its contents. The emails clearly showed Elena initiating contact about column topics, submitting detailed outlines and drafts, engaging in substantive editorial discussions about research methodology and writing style, and responding to reader feedback with sophisticated analysis of medical trends and treatment protocols. "Dr. Harrison," Catherine Morrison continued, "can you describe Mrs. Whitfield's typical writing and research process?" Dr. Harrison nodded approvingly. "Elena typically begins each column by identifying emerging trends in medical research through systematic review of current literature. She analyzes dozens of peer-reviewed studies, interviews researchers and clinicians, and synthesizes complex information into accessible narratives that advance medical understanding. Her work demonstrates exceptional facility with both scientific analysis and professional communication." Marcus felt reality tilting around him as if he were experiencing vertigo. Every word of Dr. Harrison's testimony contradicted not just his public statements about Elena's limitations, but his most fundamental beliefs about his own professional identity. "Dr. Harrison," Catherine Morrison said, producing another document, "are you familiar with this original draft of Dr. Whitfield's recent column on antibiotic resistance?" Dr. Harrison examined the pages carefully. "Yes, this is Elena's original submission for that piece. You can see her handwritten research notes in the margins, along with her analysis of the statistical significance of the clinical trial data she references." Catherine Morrison handed the document to Judge Hendricks, who studied the handwritten notes with obvious interest. The margins contained sophisticated commentary about experimental design, statistical methodology, and clinical implications, all written in Elena's distinctive handwriting. But Dr. Harrison wasn't finished with his devastating testimony. He turned slightly toward Marcus, his expression mixing professional respect with what appeared to be disappointment. I should mention that Dr. Marcus Whitfield has never submitted original writing to our journal. Our editorial relationship has been exclusively with his wife, who handles all aspects of the column creation and revision process. Marcus tried to speak, but found his voice had completely abandoned him. He looked desperately at his attorney, then at Elena, then back at Dr. Harrison, searching for some explanation that would restore his understanding of the world. Catherine Morrison pressed her advantage with surgical precision. Dr. Harrison, in your professional opinion, what level of medical knowledge and writing expertise would be required to produce the work that has been published under Dr. Whitfield's name? Dr. Harrison considered the question carefully before responding. The column requires advanced understanding of medical research methodology, statistical analysis, clinical trial interpretation, and sophisticated communication skills. The author must be capable of synthesizing information from multiple complex sources and presenting it in ways that advance professional knowledge. It represents some of the most challenging work in medical journalism. He paused momentarily before delivering what amounted to a professional eulogy for Marcus's reputation. Elena Whitfield possesses one of the most sophisticated intellects I have encountered in 25 years of medical publishing. Her ability to analyze complex research, identify emerging trends, and communicate findings with both rigor and clarity is truly exceptional. The medical profession owes her an enormous debt of gratitude for her contributions to professional education and clinical understanding. Marcus finally found his voice, though it emerged as little more than a strangled whisper. "That's impossible," he said. "I wrote those columns. I spent hours researching and writing every single piece." Dr. Harrison looked at him with what appeared to be genuine confusion. "Dr. Whitfield, in 18 years of editorial correspondence, I have never received a single piece of writing from you. All submissions, revisions, and communications have come directly from your wife." Catherine Morrison approached the witness stand with another folder. "Dr. Harrison, I'm showing you what purports to be Dr. Whitfield's research notes and original drafts for his columns. Can you examine these documents and tell us what you observe?" Dr. Harrison studied the papers for several long moments, his expression growing increasingly puzzled. These appear to be Elena's original research notes and draft materials, but someone has written Dr. Marcus Whitfield's name at the top of each page. The handwriting, research methodology, and analytical approach are clearly Elena's work, though the attribution has been changed. The implications of this revelation crashed over Marcus like a tsunami. Not only had Elena been writing his columns, but he had apparently been claiming credit for her work so completely that he had convinced even himself of his authorship. Elena watched her husband's face as the full scope of his self-deception became clear. She remembered the countless nights she had spent researching medical journals, analyzing clinical trials, and crafting the prose that had made Marcus famous. She remembered sliding her completed drafts under his office door and listening to him make minor edits before submitting her work under his name. Most painfully, she remembered how Marcus had gradually begun to believe his own fiction about being the intellectual architect of columns that represented her most challenging and sophisticated work. He had internalized the public praise so completely that he had forgotten the woman who actually deserved the recognition. Catherine Morrison called one final witness to complete the devastating revelation. Dr. Patricia Chun, whom both Marcus and Elena remembered from the medical conference, took the stand with obvious reluctance to participate in such a painful exposure of professional deception. "Dr. Chun," Catherine Morrison began, "you have known both Dr. and Mrs. Whitfield professionally for several years. Can you tell the court about your interactions with them regarding medical writing and research?" Dr. Chin looked directly at Elena before responding. "Elena and I have maintained extensive correspondence about research methodology and clinical implications for nearly a decade. She regularly consults with me about complex cases and emerging treatment protocols. Her insights have influenced my own research and clinical practice in significant ways. She paused before delivering what amounted to a professional character assassination of Marcus. I have never had a substantive professional conversation with Dr. Marcus Whitfield about medical research or writing. When I've attempted to discuss technical aspects of his published work with him, his responses have been surprisingly vague and general, lacking the precision I would expect from the column's actual author. The courtroom had grown so quiet that the sound of Marcus's labored breathing was audible from the witness stand. His entire professional identity was collapsing in real time, witnessed by judge, attorneys, and court reporters who would undoubtedly spread word of these revelations throughout the medical community. Catherine Morrison turned toward Marcus one final time. "Dr. Whitfield," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "you have built your entire career on work produced by the woman you have consistently dismissed as intellectually inadequate. The columns that made you famous, the awards that elevated your reputation, the book deals that promised to cement your legacy, all of it represents Elena's intellectual achievement, not your own." Marcus sat in stunned silence as the magnitude of his deception became fully apparent. He had not merely underestimated his wife's capabilities. He had systematically stolen credit for work that represented her most sophisticated professional contributions. The realization that his celebrated medical writing career was essentially an elaborate fraud left him feeling as if his entire sense of self were disintegrating. Elena observed her husband's destruction with complex emotions. There was satisfaction in finally seeing her work acknowledged and Marcus's arrogance shattered. But there was also something approaching sadness at witnessing the complete collapse of a man who had built his identity on foundations that had never actually existed. The truth was finally out, and it was more devastating than anyone in that courtroom could have imagined. Judge Hendricks called for a 30-minute recess to review the overwhelming evidence that had been presented. During this time, Marcus sat motionless at the defendant's table, staring blankly at the mahogany surface as if he could somehow find answers in the wood grain. His attorney, Richard Blackwood, attempted to discuss potential strategies for salvaging their position, but Marcus seemed incapable of processing information or making coherent responses. Elena remained composed beside Catherine Morrison, though she felt the weight of 18 years of suppressed truth finally lifting from her shoulders. The systematic revelation of her intellectual contributions had been more cathartic than she had anticipated, transforming years of silent frustration into public vindication that felt almost surreal. When court reconvened, Judge Hendricks addressed both parties with the measured authority that had characterized her distinguished judicial career. After careful consideration of the evidence presented today, she began, her voice carrying through the silent courtroom. "I find that Mrs. Elena Whitfield was the sole intellectual author of the medical columns published under Dr. Marcus Whitfield's name for the past 18 years. Marcus flinched as if he had been physically struck, while Elena felt a rush of validation that was both exhilarating and overwhelming. Judge Hendricks continued with methodical precision. "The court awards Mrs. Whitfield full intellectual property rights to all published columns, including any derivative works such as books, anthologies, or digital compilations. She is hereby recognized as the legal author of this body of work, with all associated royalties, licensing fees, and future publication rights reverting to her exclusively." The judge paused to allow the full implications of her ruling to sink in before delivering the most devastating blow to Marcus's remaining professional standing. Furthermore, this court finds that Dr. Marcus Whitfield engaged in systematic intellectual fraud by claiming credit for work he did not create. This ruling will be forwarded to the American Medical Writers Association, the Journal of American Medicine, and other relevant professional organizations for their consideration regarding disciplinary actions. Marcus's face had turned ashen as the reality of complete professional destruction settled over him. Not only was he losing the intellectual property that had made him famous, but his fraudulent behavior would be reported to every major medical writing organization in the country. Within hours of the court's decision, news of the ruling began spreading through the medical community with the velocity that only truly shocking revelations can achieve. Dr. Michael Harrison contacted Elena directly to discuss transitioning the column attribution to her real name, a conversation that felt like stepping into sunlight after years of living in shadows. "Elena," Dr. Harrison said during their phone call that evening, I want to formally apologize for our role in perpetuating this deception, even unknowingly. Your work deserves proper recognition, and we are committed to ensuring that future publications clearly identify you as the author of this exceptional body of medical writing. The following week, the Journal of American Medicine published an unprecedented editorial acknowledging Elena as the true author of the acclaimed medical column and announcing that future pieces would appear under her own name. The editorial praised her contributions to medical education and expressed regret that her intellectual achievements had been obscured for so long. The response from the medical community was swift and overwhelmingly supportive. Elena received dozens of congratulatory emails from physicians who had been influenced by her writing, many expressing shock and admiration upon learning the true identity of the author whose work had shaped their clinical understanding. Dr. Patricia Chun was among the first to reach out, offering collaboration opportunities and praising Elena's courage in finally claiming credit for her intellectual contributions. Meanwhile, Marcus faced the professional consequences of his exposed fraud with devastating swiftness. The American Medical Writers Association revoked his Lifetime Achievement Award and expelled him from the organization. Speaking engagements were canceled, his book contract was terminated, and several medical journals announced they would no longer accept submissions from him pending investigation of his other published work. The publisher who had been eager to work with Marcus on his medical writing anthology quickly pivoted, approaching Elena about authoring the book under her own name. The advance they offered was substantially larger than what Marcus had originally negotiated, reflecting both the quality of the work and the compelling story of its true authorship. Elena found herself inundated with professional opportunities that had been unimaginable just weeks earlier. Harvard Medical School invited her to deliver a keynote address about medical communication ethics. Stanford offered her a visiting professorship in their medical writing program. Multiple medical journals approached her about serving on editorial boards and contributing regular columns under her own byline. Most satisfying of all was the call she received from Dr. Sarah Chun, her former mentor at Columbia. "Elena," Dr. Chun said, her voice warm with genuine pride, "I always knew you were destined for great things in medical writing. Seeing you finally receive the recognition you deserve has been one of the highlights of my career. We would be honored if you would consider joining our journal as senior editor for medical communication." Elena accepted the position, which represented not just professional advancement, but symbolic vindication of intellectual capabilities that had been dismissed and undermined for nearly 2 decades. Her first day at the journal felt like stepping into a life that had always been waiting for her to claim it. The contrast with Marcus's situation could not have been more stark. He had been forced to leave his position at the hospital where he had practiced medicine, unable to withstand the professional scrutiny that followed revelations about his fraudulent writing career. Colleagues who had once sought his opinions now avoided contact, unwilling to be associated with someone whose intellectual credibility had been so thoroughly discredited. Marcus attempted to rebuild his reputation through private practice, but patients began requesting different physicians once word spread about his professional deception. The medical community, which values intellectual integrity above almost all other qualities, had effectively shunned him for violating the fundamental trust that underlies professional relationships. 6 months after the court ruling, Elena received an invitation that felt like the ultimate validation of her transformation. The Kennedy Center, the same venue where Marcus had humiliated her during his acceptance speech, invited her to receive the Medical Communication Excellence Award, recognizing her contributions to advancing medical education through exceptional writing. As Elena prepared for the ceremony, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the years of silence, the countless nights spent researching and writing while receiving no recognition, and the gradual erosion of her confidence under Marcus's constant dismissals of her intellectual capabilities. But she also thought about the strength she had discovered in finally claiming her rightful place as an accomplished medical writer and researcher. The woman who had once sat quietly while her husband mocked her supposed limitations had transformed into someone who commanded respect from the most distinguished professionals in medicine. On the evening of the ceremony, Elena stood at the same podium where Marcus had delivered his devastating speech about her intellectual inadequacies. The irony was so profound that she paused for a moment to fully appreciate the complete reversal of their circumstances. Tonight, she began, addressing an audience that included many of the same medical professionals who had witnessed her public humiliation. I want to speak about the importance of recognizing intellectual contributions wherever they originate, regardless of the assumptions we might make about people based on their background or circumstances. She spoke eloquently about the challenges of medical communication, the responsibility of writers to advance understanding rather than simply convey information, and the vital role that clear scientific writing plays in improving patient care. Her speech was met with sustained applause and widespread recognition of the exceptional intellect that had been hidden for so long. Before we conclude tonight's incredible story of hidden truth and long overdue justice, I'm curious about your thoughts. Have you ever encountered someone whose true capabilities were completely underestimated by those around them? Or perhaps you've had your own abilities dismissed by people who should have known better. This story of Elena's triumph reminds us that intellectual worth isn't always immediately visible, and that the most confident assumptions can sometimes be the most wrong. Share your thoughts in the comments about what this story means to you. In the months that followed, Elena's career continued to flourish in ways that exceeded her most optimistic expectations. Her medical writing influenced treatment protocols across the country. Her research shaped clinical guidelines, and her expertise was sought by the most prestigious institutions in medicine. She had become the intellectual authority that Marcus had only pretended to be. Marcus, meanwhile, had essentially vanished from professional medical circles, his reputation so thoroughly destroyed that rehabilitation seemed impossible. He had lost not just his career and professional standing, but also the respect of colleagues who had once celebrated him as a brilliant medical communicator. The story of Elena's triumph became something of a legend in medical writing circles, cited as an example of how intellectual fraud ultimately destroys those who practice it while elevating those whose genuine contributions deserve recognition. Medical schools began using her case as a teaching example about professional ethics and the importance of proper attribution in academic and professional writing. As Elena settled into her new life as a recognized authority in medical communication, she often reflected on the profound lesson her experience had taught her about the nature of intellectual worth and professional recognition. True expertise cannot be faked indefinitely, and genuine contributions will eventually find their way to the surface, no matter how long they remain hidden. The woman who had once been dismissed as intellectually inadequate had proven that the most devastating assumptions about human capability often reveal more about those making the judgments than about those being judged. Marcus's arrogance had not only led to his own professional destruction, but had also prevented him from recognizing the extraordinary intellectual gift that had been contributing to his success all along. Elena's story became a powerful reminder that intellectual worth exists independent of recognition, that brilliance can be disguised by circumstances, and that the most confident dismissals of human capability are sometimes the most spectacularly wrong. In the end, truth had not only prevailed, but had delivered justice more complete and satisfying than anyone could have imagined.